Good evening, dear friends, and welcome back. If you are here, then you are exactly the kind of person who notices things. The small things, the telling things, the kind of detail that others walk past without a second glance. But you? You pause, you look again, and sometimes that second look changes everything. Tonight, we step away from the noise of the world and into something quieter, and yet far more dangerous. A grand English manor. A bitter winter night, snow falling so thickly that no one can leave and no one can enter, and somewhere in that silence, behind a frosted window on the first floor, something has gone terribly wrong. There is blood in the snow, and Hercule Poirot is already watching. So settle in, dear friends. Pour yourself something warm. Because tonight, the frost does not hide, it reveals. The invitation to Coldmarsh Hall. It was the kind of cold that does not merely chill the body. It settles into the bones quietly, like an unwelcome guest who has decided to stay the winter. Hercule Poirot sat in the back seat of a hired motor car, his coat buttoned to the very top, his gloved hands folded neatly in his lap, and his magnificent moustaches, of which he was, it must be said, extraordinarily proud, wrapped in a thin woolen scarf that his valet Georges had insisted upon before he left London. He had resisted, naturally. A man of his appearance did not muffle his finest feature in grey wool. But somewhere past the second hour of driving through the flat, frost-bitten English countryside, he had conceded defeat and wrapped it anyway. The date was the 14th of January, 1951. The road to Coldmarsh Hall had narrowed considerably in the last mile. The bare hedgerows pressing close on either side, like spectators leaning in to watch something they already knew would end badly. The driver, a local man from the village of Ashcroft Hollow, taciturn and red-cheeked, had said very little since collecting Poirot from the small railway station. He had said even less as the sky had begun to darken, and the first serious flakes of snow had begun to fall. "How much further?" Poirot asked, not for the first time. "Quarter-mile, sir. Give or take." Poirot gave a small suffering sigh and returned his gaze to the window. He had come at the personal invitation of Mr. Edmund Hartwell, the owner of Coldmarsh Hall, and a man of considerable, if quietly managed, fortune. They had met some years prior through a mutual acquaintance in Brussels, a connection so distant and unlikely that Poirot himself had nearly forgotten it. But Hartwell had not forgotten. His letter, which had arrived at Poirot's Whitehaven mansions flat on a grey Tuesday morning, had been precise, courteous, and Poirot admitted this only to himself. Intriguing. "My dear Monsieur Poirot," the letter had read, "I find myself in a position of some delicacy. I am hosting a small gathering at my country estate this January, no more than 7 guests, and I confess that among them I count at least one person whose motives I do not fully trust. I do not wish to speak plainly in a letter. I ask only that you come. Consider it a quiet weekend in the English countryside, if nothing else." A man who invited Hercule Poirot to a country weekend and mentioned, almost in passing, that one of his guests could not be trusted. That was not a man seeking pleasant company. That was a man who was frightened. And so Poirot had come. Coldmarsh Hall revealed itself slowly, the way grand old English houses always did. First a chimney stack visible above the tree line, then the upper windows catching the last grey light of the afternoon. And finally, the whole of it, a wide, heavy-shouldered manor house of dark stone, 3 stories tall, with ivy frozen stiff against its eastern face, and a long gravel drive that had been swallowed almost entirely by snow. 2 stone lions flanked the front steps, their expressions, caught somewhere between dignity and disdain, dusted white at the ears. The motor car crunched to a halt. The driver did not offer to help with the luggage. Poirot stepped out, planted his feet carefully on the frozen gravel, and looked up at the house. There was a light in every window on the ground floor. On the first floor, most windows were dark, all except one at the far eastern end of the building. That window glowed with a soft amber warmth. Someone was in that room. Poirot noted it. He noted most things, even when he appeared to be doing nothing of the sort. Edmund Hartwell met him in the entrance hall. A tall man in his late 50s, lean and silver-haired, with the kind of careful, contained manner that suggested a person who had long ago learned to keep his feelings somewhere private. He shook Poirot's hand with both of his own, which was either warmth or anxiety. Poirot suspected it was both. "Monsieur Poirot, you came, I am genuinely relieved. You are also," Poirot observed pleasantly, "somewhat pale, mon ami, but we shall speak of that later. First, you introduce me to your guests, yes? As simply an old acquaintance. Nothing more." Hartwell nodded quickly. "Of course, naturally. Yes." They moved through to the drawing room, where a fire had been built up generously, and the assembled company had gathered in that particular way of English house parties. Small, conversational clusters, drinks in hand. The surface of things maintained with great politeness, while underneath, Poirot suspected, something else entirely was being maintained with equal effort. He took them in quietly as Hartwell made introductions. Mrs. Dorothea Fenwick, a widow of perhaps 65, sharp-eyed and upright in a dark green dress, with the sort of composed expression that either meant she was very calm or very practiced at appearing so. She acknowledged Poirot with a measured smile and returned immediately to her sherry. Mr. Gerald Fenwick, Dorothea's son, 30 or so, pleasant enough in face and manner, though his eyes moved around the room rather too frequently for a man who was supposed to be relaxed. He wore his dinner jacket as if it were slightly the wrong size, though it fit him perfectly. Miss Sylvia Crail, perhaps 40, unmarried by choice or circumstance, Poirot could not yet say, with ink-stained fingers and the distracted air of a woman whose thoughts were never entirely in the room she occupied, a writer of some kind he suspected, or an academic. Dr. Humphrey Voss, a retired physician, heavy-set and comfortable, with a broad red face and the unshakable good humor of a man who had seen enough of human suffering to have made his peace with it. He shook Poirot's hand vigorously. "Belgian, are you? Splendid. Splendid people, the Belgians." Poirot accepted this with grace. "Miss Thomas Wraith." Here Poirot paused, almost imperceptibly. Wraith was perhaps 50, narrow-featured, with dark hair going grey at the temples, and a stillness about him that was not the stillness of ease. It was the stillness of a man who was watching. He and Poirot regarded each other for a moment during the introduction. 2 men, Poirot thought, who both made a habit of observing others, and who both knew in that instant that they had been observed in return. "Monsieur Wraith," Poirot said. "Monsieur Poirot," Wraith replied. nothing more. And finally, Miss Agnes Hartwell, Edmund's younger sister, a woman of perhaps 52, soft-spoken and gentle, who pressed Poirot's hand and said she hoped he would be warm enough and that the East Wing could be dreadfully cold in January, and had he eaten because cook had kept something back. Poirot liked her immediately. Dinner was served at 7:30. It was, by English country house standards, perfectly adequate. A clear soup, a roasted joint, potatoes that had been near a fire long enough to have developed opinions about it. And the conversation moved through the usual channels of such evenings: the weather, the state of the railways, whether the village of Ashcroft Hollow had changed much in recent years. It had not. Poirot ate steadily and spoke little, which no one appeared to find unusual. He watched, he listened. He noticed that Mrs. Dorothea Fenwick spoke to Thomas Wraith exactly twice during the meal, and both times with a precision that suggested she had decided, in advance, exactly what she would and would not say to him. He noticed that Gerald Fenwick drank rather more than he ate. He noticed that Sylvia Crail watched Edmund Hartwell with an expression he could not yet name, something between concern and calculation, and he noticed that Wraith, across the table, watched no one in particular, which, in Poirot's experience, meant he was watching everyone. After dinner, the snow outside had thickened considerably. Hartwell stood at the drawing-room window, his reflection ghostly against the dark glass, and said quietly to Poirot, who had come to stand beside him, "The road will be impassable by morning." "Yes," said Poirot, "I had supposed as much. No one will be able to leave." "No," Poirot agreed, "nor I think." There was a pause. Outside, the snow fell in slow, heavy curtains across the front lawn. "Are you frightened, mon ami?" Poirot asked without turning from the window. Hartwell was silent for a moment. Then, very quietly, "Yes, I rather think I am." Poirot nodded once, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. "Then," he said, "we shall see what the morning brings. Blood beneath the frost." The morning brought silence first. That particular silence of a house that has been sealed overnight by weather. No sound of motors on the drive, no distant crunch of boots on gravel, no birdsong, only the muffled, cottoned quiet of a world buried under several inches of fresh snow. Coldmarsh Hall had drawn itself inward, the way old houses do in winter, and the world outside had obligingly disappeared. Poirot was awake before 7. He had not slept especially well. The East Wing bedroom assigned to him was, as Agnes Hartwell had warned, cold in a way that the extra blanket had only partially addressed. And the old house had spoken throughout the night in the language of old houses, creaks and settlings, a pipe somewhere that knocked irregularly, the distant sound of a window latch that had not been properly secured and tapped against its frame in the small hours like a person trying, without much urgency, to get in. He lay in the dark for some time, listening, not to the house, or not only to the house. He was listening, in the way he sometimes did in the quiet before a day began, to the gathering shape of things, to what he had seen the previous evening, arranged now in the order his mind preferred. Not chronological, not by person, but by weight, by significance. Mrs. Fenwick and her careful silences toward Wraith. Gerald Fenwick and his wine-glass, refilled 3 times before the soup was cleared. Sylvia Crail watching Hartwell with that expression, Poirot still had not named, Wraith watching no one, and Hartwell himself at the window after dinner, saying, "I am frightened," in the voice of a man who was not given to admitting such things. Poirot rose, dressed with his customary thoroughness. He did not believe in the sort of man who dressed carelessly simply because he was in the country, and went downstairs at 7:20 to find the house still and the kitchen only just beginning to wake. He accepted a cup of tea from the cook, a stout, silent woman named Mrs. Beach, who regarded guests who appeared before 8 with the mild hostility of a professional, and carried it to the small sitting room at the back of the house, which looked out over the rear garden. The snow was extraordinary. It had come up past the lower terrace steps in the night, smoothing the garden into a single unbroken white plain. The ornamental hedges were rounded shapes now, softened and anonymous. The stone birdbath near the garden wall had disappeared entirely. Poirot stood at the window with his tea and looked out at it. It was then that he saw the window. The rear face of Coldmarsh Hall ran east to west, and Poirot was standing at its western end. The first-floor windows above the garden were all dark and frosted with the night's cold, all of them carrying that particular opacity of glass that has been cold for many hours, the frost forming in small feathered patterns across the panes, blurring whatever lay behind them to indistinction, all except one. The second window from the eastern end, which Poirot, consulting his memory of the house's layout, placed as belonging to one of the guest bedrooms, had its frost disturbed. Not broken, not opened, disturbed, as if something warm had briefly pressed against the inside of the glass, or as if the room beyond had been, at some point in the night, considerably warmer than its neighbors. And below that window, in the snow of the rear garden, perhaps 8 feet beneath the sill, there was a stain, dark, irregular, spreading from a central point in a way that snow absorbs liquid, slowly at first, then pulling it down and outward in a pattern that was unmistakable to any person who had seen such a thing before. Poirot set down his teacup. He stood very still for a moment, looking at the stain in the snow. Then he turned and walked with some speed, back through the house and up the main staircase. The door to the eastern guest bedroom, room 4, as the small brass number on the door indicated, was closed. Poirot stood before it in the corridor for a moment, his hand not yet raised to knock. He was aware, in the way he was sometimes aware of such things before the fact had been confirmed, that what lay on the other side of this door would change the nature of everything that had happened since his arrival at Coldmarsh Hall. He knocked. No answer. He tried the handle. The door was unlocked. He opened it. The room was cold, far colder than the corridor, cold in a way that was immediately and unpleasantly explained by the window, which stood open an inch at the bottom sash. Not wide open, just an inch. Enough to have admitted throughout the night the slow creeping chill of a January that had no interest in mercy. The frost on the inside of the glass had been disturbed exactly as Poirot had observed from below, smeared in 2 parallel vertical lines, as if hands had pressed against the pane, or perhaps gripped the lower sash from inside. Thomas Wraith lay on the floor beside the window. He was on his back, one arm extended toward the sill, Above him, the other folded beneath him at an angle that suggested he had fallen rather than lain down. He was fully dressed, the same dark dinner jacket from the previous evening, and his eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling with the absolute incurious attention of the dead. There was blood. Not a great quantity of it, but enough. A dark stain spreading from beneath his left shoulder, absorbed by the carpet in a roughly circular shape that had dried and darkened in the cold of the night. Poirot stood in the doorway. He did not enter the room immediately. This was not hesitation, it was method. He looked first. He looked at everything. The position of the body, the open window, the frost on the glass, the single overturned glass on the small writing table near the door. Whiskey, by the smell of it, the liquid long since absorbed into the carpet in a second smaller stain near the table leg. The wardrobe door standing a few inches open. The bed, which had not been slept in. The coverlet still drawn tight, the pillows undisturbed. Wraith had never gone to bed. Poirot entered the room carefully, keeping to the edges, and crouched beside the body with the particular unhurried attention of a man who had done this before, and knew the value of doing it slowly. The wound, as far as he could determine without disturbing the body, was to the left side, below the shoulder blade. A single wound. The jacket was torn there, very cleanly, in a way that suggested something narrow and sharp rather than broad. A knife, almost certainly, not a large one. Wraith's expression, and Poirot looked at it carefully, was not one of fear. It was something closer to surprise, not the violent surprise of a sudden attack, but a quieter version. The surprise of a man who had perhaps recognized in the last moment something he had not expected to recognize. Poirot stood slowly. His knees were not what they had been, and he acknowledged this with a brief private expression of irritation before composing himself. He looked again at the window, at the frost on the glass, at the stain below in the snow, which he could just see from this angle. Dark against the white, clearly visible from the garden, but not, he realized, from anywhere else. Not from the drive which faced the front of the house, not from the lane beyond the gate. Only from the rear garden, which was enclosed, which had no footprints in the snow, and which no one had apparently entered or exited during the night. The window had been used. He was certain of it. Something, or the evidence of something, had passed through this window. But not a person. The snow below was undisturbed save for the stain. No footprints, no impressions of a body landing, only the blood. Only the blood which had somehow come through the glass. Poirot frowned. He did not like puzzles that presented themselves this way, with the impossible sitting squarely in the middle of the room, daring him to explain it. His little grey cells, as he was fond of calling them, had encountered such things before. They would encounter this one too. But he allowed himself, standing in that cold room with the dead man on the floor, and the frost on the window, and the blood in the snow 8 feet below, one brief moment of honest admission. This, he thought, was going to require some care. He turned, left the room exactly as he had found it, and went to wake Edmund Hartwell. The closed circle Edmund Hartwell took the news the way certain Englishmen take bad news, with a visible effort to appear as though he were not receiving it at all. He sat on the edge of his bed in his dressing gown, hands folded in his lap, and listened while Poirot spoke quietly and precisely. And when Poirot had finished, Hartwell said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Wraith, of all of them." "You are not entirely surprised," Poirot observed. Hartwell looked up. "No," he said after a pause. "I am not entirely surprised." "Then perhaps," Poirot said, settling into the chair near the window with the patience of a man who had learned long ago that the first useful conversation of any investigation happened before breakfast. "You will tell me what you meant in your letter when you said you did not fully trust one of your guests." Hartwell was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the snow was still falling, lighter now, but steady as if it had decided on a pace and saw no reason to vary it. "I invited Wraith," Hartwell said at last, "because I felt I had no choice. That is an interesting beginning. He had something of mine, documents, financial in nature, private correspondence between myself and a business associate in Geneva, from several years ago, relating to a transaction that was not illegal, precisely, but that would have been difficult to explain to certain parties." He paused. "Wraith had obtained copies. I do not know how. He contacted me in November and suggested very politely that a quiet weekend in the country might give us the opportunity to discuss their return." "He was blackmailing you," Poirot said without particular emphasis. He preferred the word negotiating. "They often do." Poirot looked at him steadily. "And the others? Why were they here?" "The others were genuine guests. Dorothea Fenwick is an old friend of my late wife. She and her son come every January. It is a long-standing arrangement. Sylvia Crail is my late wife's niece, though we have remained close. Dr. Voss I have known for 30 years. Agnes, of course, lives here." He spread his hands. "I could not uninvite my regular guests simply because Wraith was coming. That would have seemed peculiar, and I told myself, that his presence among others would be safer. That nothing unpleasant could happen with a house full of people." Poirot did not comment on this reasoning, which had proven, in the most definitive possible way, to be incorrect. "Did any of the others know Wraith?" he asked instead. Hartwell hesitated. "I believe Dorothea may have known him or known of him. She reacted when I mentioned his name in my letter, confirming the guest list. She did not explain her reaction, and I did not press her. And your sister Agnes? Agnes knows very little of my business affairs. I prefer it that way." Poirot nodded slowly. "You will dress now," he said, rising. "And then you will ask everyone to gather in the drawing room. You will tell them that there has been a serious incident, nothing more, and you will attempt. I ask this particularly to observe their faces when you say it." They assembled at 8:30. The drawing room at that hour had a different quality to it than it had possessed the previous evening. The fire had been built up again, but the warmth it offered seemed, under the circumstances, unconvincing. The curtains had been drawn back, and the morning light, pale, flat, reflected off the snow outside, laid everything in the room out with a kind of merciless clarity. There was nowhere, in that light, to look anything other than exactly what one was. Poirot stood near the fireplace. He did not sit. Standing, he had found over many years, gave a man a certain advantage in rooms where everyone else was seated. Not of height, necessarily, since Poirot was not a tall man, and was under no illusions on this point, but of attention. People looked at the person standing, and Poirot, when he wished to be looked at, was perfectly content to be looked at. Hartwell spoke briefly. "A serious incident. Mr. Wraith, room 4. He got no further before the reactions began to arrive, each one distinct, each one, to Poirot's watching eye, entirely its own. Mrs. Dorothea Fenwick went very still. Not the stillness of shock, the stillness of a woman receiving information she had, on some level, been waiting for. Her sherry glass, which she had been holding, was set down on the side table beside her, with a precision that was almost ceremonial. Gerald Fenwick said, "Good God," loudly, and then looked immediately at his mother, as if checking to see how he should feel about it. Sylvia Crail closed her eyes for a moment, just a moment, and then opened them and looked directly at Edmund Hartwell, with an expression that Poirot this time was finally able to name. It was not concern, it was not calculation, it was relief. Quickly suppressed, professionally suppressed, but there, unmistakable to a man who had spent 40 years reading human faces in difficult rooms. Dr. Voss said nothing. He leaned forward slightly in his armchair and looked at Poirot, and his expression was that of a doctor who has just understood that his professional opinion is going to be required, and who is already quietly preparing himself for it. And Agnes Hartwell, gentle, soft-spoken Agnes, pressed both hands flat against her knees and said, in a very small voice, "Oh, Edmund, I was afraid of this." The room went very quiet. Poirot watched her. "You were afraid of this, Mademoiselle Agnes?" he said gently. "In what sense, precisely?" Agnes looked up, color rising in her face. "I only meant a stranger in the house in winter, and Edmund so worried these past weeks." She stopped, looked at her brother. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that." "On the contrary," Poirot said pleasantly, "it is often the things we feel we should not have said that are most worth saying." Poirot spoke to them collectively for perhaps 10 minutes. He was calm. He was, if anything, conversational, explaining that the road was impassable, that no one could leave, that the telephone line appeared to have been affected by the storm, that Dr. Voss had kindly agreed to examine the body in the interim, and that Poirot himself would be asking each of them, individually, some questions in the course of the morning. "Are you suggesting," Gerald Fenwick said, with the slightly aggressive air of a man who felt the situation was proceeding in a direction he had not consented to, "that one of us killed him?" "I am suggesting," Poirot replied with great pleasantness, "that someone killed him, and that, until we have established rather more than we presently know, it would be unwise to suggest anything else. You will remain, if you please, in the public rooms of the house. You will not go upstairs unaccompanied, and you will not, I ask this particularly, discuss the matter among yourselves until I have had the opportunity to speak with each of you alone." He said this last with a smile that was entirely friendly and entirely inflexible. Several people, Poirot noted, found it difficult to hold his gaze when he smiled, that particular smile. Gerald Fenwick was one of them. Dr. Voss examined the body while Poirot stood in the doorway of room 4 and asked quiet questions. "Single wound," Voss confirmed, straightening with some effort. "Left side between the 5th and 6th rib, angled slightly upward. Something narrow. A stiletto blade, I would say, or something very like it. Death would have been, Not immediate, but not long. 10 minutes, perhaps 15. He would have been conscious for some of it. He paused, looking down at Wraith's face. He didn't call out, though. Nothing was heard in the night, nothing was reported, Poirot said, which is itself a thing worth considering. Time of death? Difficult to be precise in this cold. The room temperature would have slowed things considerably. Voss frowned, thinking. Sometime between 11 in the evening and 2 in the morning, I would estimate. No earlier, possibly a little later, but not much. He was fully dressed, Poirot noted. He had not prepared for bed. He was expecting something, Voss said. Or someone. Yes, Poirot agreed. That is what I think also. He looked again at the window, at the frosted glass, the smeared pane, the inch of cold air still admitted at the bottom sash. He looked at the position of the body, the extended arm reaching toward the sill. He looked at the overturned whiskey glass near the table. 2 people, he thought, had been in this room last night. One had left through the door. One had not left at all. But the window still troubled him, not who had used it. He was beginning to form a thought about that. What troubled him was why. Why the window when the door was unlocked? Why the frost disturbed from the inside? Why the blood in the snow, 8 feet below, with no marks of a fall, no footprints, no disturbance in the white surface below, only the stain, spreading dark and slow and patient, as if it had all the time in the world. He turned it over in his mind, carefully, like a man turning a stone to see what lives beneath it. Not yet, he told himself. Not yet. There was still much to learn. He thanked Dr. Voss, pulled the door of room 4, closed behind him, and went downstairs to begin. The little grey cells at work Poirot began with Mrs. Dorothea Fenwick. This was deliberate, in any closed group of people carrying secrets. And Poirot had, by this point in his career, encountered enough of them to have formed certain reliable opinions. There was always one person who knew more than they had said, and who had been waiting, with varying degrees of patience, for someone to ask them the right question. Mrs. Fenwick, with her careful stillness and her precisely placed sherry glass, struck him as exactly that kind of person. Not the killer, he did not think so, not yet, but a person in possession of context. And context, in Poirot's experience, was frequently more useful than confession. Hartwell had made his study available for the interviews. A small, book-lined room off the main corridor, with 2 armchairs drawn up near a fire that had been freshly laid. Poirot sat in one. He gestured Mrs. Fenwick to the other, with the courtesy of a man receiving a guest rather than conducting an interrogation, which was entirely intentional. She sat. She arranged her skirt. She looked at him with those sharp, composed eyes and said, before he had spoken a word, "You want to know about Thomas Wraith. I want to know whatever you feel it would be useful for me to know," Poirot said pleasantly, "which I suspect is rather more than you have told anyone else." A brief pause, then the faintest acknowledgement. Not quite a smile. Wraith was a collector, she said. Not of art, not of objects, of information. Of the kind of information that people would prefer remained private. He had been doing it for, 20 years, I should think. Longer, perhaps. He was very discreet about it, very methodical. You knew him well. I knew of him. My late husband knew him rather better. She was quiet for a moment. My husband made certain investments in the late 1940s. that did not reflect well on his judgment. Wraith had documentation relating to those investments. He was gracious about it in his way. He never made explicit demands. He simply made it known from time to time that the documentation existed. And my husband made certain accommodations. And after your husband's death, Wraith transferred his attention to me. She said this with a flatness that conveyed more effectively than any display of emotion could have exactly what 20 years of that attention had cost her. I have been making accommodations of my own. Poirot looked at her carefully. And Gerald? Does he know? Gerald knows that we have a financial obligation to certain parties. He does not know the nature of it. She met Poirot's eyes directly. I have protected him from it. That has been my primary occupation for the past 6 years. Where were you last night, madame? Between the hours of 11 and 2. In my room. Asleep. A pause. Gerald checked on me at 10:30. He does when he has been drinking. He worries. He knocked. I told him I was perfectly well. He went to his own room. After that, I did not leave mine until this morning. And Gerald? Did you hear him in the corridor after that? The faintest hesitation. No, she said, I did not. Gerald Fenwick, when he arrived in the study 20 minutes later, had the look of a man who had not slept, and was aware that this fact was visible and was unhappy about both things. He sat in the armchair with his long legs extended and his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that Mrs. Beach had produced and that he had carried with him from the kitchen, with the determination of a man who felt the situation required it. I know what you're going to ask, he said before Poirot could begin. Then, by all means, Poirot said, settling back, tell me. Gerald looked at him, looked away, looked at his coffee. I went to see Wraith last night. Poirot said nothing. He had learned, over many decades, that silence was frequently the most productive question. I went at about 11:30, I think. Perhaps 11:45. I knocked. He opened the door. We spoke. Gerald's jaw tightened. I knew about my mother, about what he had been holding over her, over us, for years. I found out 6 months ago, going through some of my father's old correspondence. I confronted Wraith in November, in London. He paused, searching for the word, unmoved. He suggested we might discuss it further at Coldmarsh, that Edmund had also invited him, which he seemed to find amusing. And last night, what was said between you? I told him it was finished, that I had consulted a solicitor, that the documents he held were not as legally significant as he had represented them to be, and that we would not be making any further accommodations. Gerald's voice was controlled, but had a tightness beneath it. He laughed, not a cruel laugh exactly, more the laugh of a man who has heard similar things before and is not concerned. He stopped. And then? Poirot prompted. And then I left. He looked up. He was alive when I left him, standing at the window. He'd gone to look out at the snow while I was speaking. He was alive, and he was standing, and I left. He was at the window when you left, Poirot said with careful neutrality. The window that faces the rear garden. Yes. Was the window open? Gerald frowned. No, it was closed. Frosted on the outside. I remember noticing the frost on the glass when he went to stand there. He put his hand on the sill. I remember thinking it must be cold to the touch. Poirot filed this away with the precision of a man sorting correspondence. What time did you leave his room? Perhaps midnight, not much past. Did you see anyone in the corridor? Hear anything? Gerald hesitated for just a fraction of a second too long. No, he said. Nothing. Poirot noted the hesitation. He did not pursue it, not yet. Sylvia Crail came to the study at 11 o'clock and sat with her ink-stained hands folded in her lap and answered Poirot's questions with the concise, undecorated directness of a woman who had thought carefully, between the drawing-room and the study door, about exactly what she was going to say. She had known Thomas Wraith, she said. She had known him for 3 years. In what capacity? Poirot asked. He was researching a book, she said. Or so he told me. A social history of certain financial circles in post-war Britain. He approached me as a writer, said he admired my work, wanted my advice on structure and presentation. A pause. I helped him for some months before I understood what the book actually was. It was not a book. It was a catalogue of people and their vulnerabilities. And when you understood this, I ended the association. Her voice was even. I told him I wanted nothing further to do with him, and that if he attempted to use anything I had helped him compile, I would go directly to the people concerned and tell them everything. That was a courageous position, Poirot observed. It was the only defensible one. She looked at him directly. I was not sorry to hear what has happened to him, Monsieur Poirot. I want to be honest with you about that. I was not sorry, but I did not do it. Where were you last night between 11 and 2? In my room, reading. I do not sleep well in the country, too quiet. The ghost of something, not quite humor. I heard Gerald Fenwick in the corridor at some point. 11:30 perhaps. Going toward the east wing, and returning perhaps 20 or 25 minutes later. You heard his return also? Yes, and someone else, perhaps half an hour after that. Poirot became very still. Someone else. I cannot say who. I heard footsteps, lighter than Gerald's, and then a door very quietly closed. She held his gaze. I should have mentioned it sooner. I know that. You have mentioned it now, Poirot said. That is what matters. Poirot interviewed Dr. Voss, who had spent the night soundly asleep, and offered this information with the complete absence of guilt of a man with an entirely clear conscience and excellent hearing, who was confident no one had passed his door, and Agnes Hartwell, who had sat with her hands pressed flat to her knees again, and told him, very quietly, that she had heard nothing and seen nothing, and that she wished, more than she could express, that Edmund had never invited that man to the house. You knew of him? Poirot asked gently. I knew what he was, Agnes said. Edmund does not tell me things directly, but I have lived in this house for 52 years, and I know my brother's face when he is frightened. After Agnes left, Poirot sat alone in the study for a few minutes. He had made, during the course of the morning, one error, a small one, but it nagged at him. He had told Gerald Fenwick, early in their conversation, that the wound had been to the right side. It had not been. It had been to the left. He had misspoken. A simple inversion. The kind of thing that happened when one was tired and cold and conducting 4 conversations in succession before lunch. He had corrected himself immediately, but Gerald had not reacted to the correction, had not blinked, had not registered the change, which meant, Poirot thought, that Gerald Fenwick had already known which side the wound was on. He sat with this for a moment, Then he reached into his jacket pocket, produced a small notebook, uncapped his pen, and wrote 3 words. He looked at them, considered. Then, beneath them, wrote 3 more. He capped the pen. Outside the study window, the snow had finally, completely stopped falling. The world lay white and sealed and silent under a sky, the color of old pewter. Nothing moved. Somewhere in this house, Poirot thought, is a person who entered a room last night, killed a man, and returned to their own bed, who has sat across from me this morning and answered my questions and looked at me with eyes that revealed almost nothing. Almost. He rose from the chair, straightened his jacket, and went to find Edmund Hartwell. There were questions, he had decided, that could no longer wait. Cracks in the frost. Edmund Hartwell was in the library. He was standing at the far end of it, not reading, not doing anything in particular, simply standing near the shelves with one hand resting on the spine of a book he had not pulled out, in the manner of a man who had come somewhere to be alone and had found that being alone was not, in fact, helping. He turned when Poirot entered. His face had a drawn quality to it that had not been there the previous evening, the particular exhaustion of a person who has been carrying something heavy and has been doing so, Poirot suspected, for considerably longer than one night. "I need to speak with you," Poirot said. "Honestly, this time." Hartwell looked at him for a moment. Then he moved to one of the leather chairs near the library window and sat with the slow deliberateness of a man conceding something. Poirot took the chair opposite. Outside the window, the stopped snow lay brilliant and undisturbed. The world was very bright and very still. "The documents," Poirot said, "the ones Wraith held, are they still in the house?" Hartwell's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, but enough. "What makes you ask that?" "Because Wraith came here for a negotiation, as you said." A man conducting a negotiation does not leave his primary instrument of leverage at home. He brings it with him. He would have had those documents, or copies of them, somewhere in this house. Poirot paused. "Which means that whoever killed him may have done so in order to retrieve them. And if that is the case, then the documents are either already gone, or they are still here, and the person who wanted them does not yet have them." Hartwell was quiet for a long moment. "I searched his room," he said finally, "this morning, while Voss was still with the body and you were interviewing the others. I am not proud of it. And nothing. His briefcase was empty. His jacket pockets, nothing. If he brought them, they are not where one would ordinarily look." Poirot nodded slowly. This confirmed something he had already suspected, that the documents were the axis around which everything else in this house was turning. Not the only axis, perhaps, but the central one. "Tell me about the Geneva transaction," he said. Hartwell looked at him sharply. "Mrs. Fenwick mentioned it in passing," Poirot said, which was not entirely accurate, but was close enough to the truth to serve. "She did not elaborate. I am asking you to do so." Another silence, longer this time. The library ticked quietly around them, the small sounds of an old room that had absorbed many conversations and given none of them back. "In 1947, Hartwell said at last, I was involved in the movement of certain assets from a private account in Geneva to a holding company registered in the Cayman Islands. The assets had originally belonged to a German industrialist. A man who had done considerable business with the National Socialist government during the war. He stopped. He had survived the war. He wished to consolidate his holdings under a less visible structure. I facilitated that. I was paid generously for doing so. And the documentation Wraith held related to your specific role in this. Yes. And Mrs. Fenwick's husband? Fenwick introduced me to the industrialist. He was the connection. Without him, the transaction would not have occurred. Hartwell looked at his hands. Dorothea has known about my role for years. We have maintained a mutual silence on the subject. It seemed the safest arrangement for both of us. Poirot looked at him steadily. And Sylvia Crail, what is her connection to all of this? Hartwell's expression changed, something moving across it that was more complicated than simple guilt. Sylvia's father, he said carefully, was the German industrialist. The library was very quiet. She knows? Poirot asked. She has known since she was a young woman. Her mother told her before she died. Sylvia has. She has never spoken of it directly to me. We have maintained between us a very careful distance from the subject. He paused. She does not know about my specific role, or she did not until Wraith began his research. And when Wraith approached her, claiming to write a social history, she would have understood immediately what he was building toward. Hartwell's voice was quiet. She is an intelligent woman. She would have seen it before he told her. Poirot was still for a moment, turning this new configuration over in his mind with the careful attention of a jeweler examining a stone that has just revealed an unexpected facet. 3 people in this house with direct and serious connections to Thomas Wraith. 3 people with reasons, substantial reasons, to want him not merely gone, but permanently, irrevocably gone. And one of them, he was increasingly certain, had acted on that reason sometime between midnight and 2 in the morning, while the snow fell, and the house slept, and no one officially heard anything, except Sylvia Crail, who had heard footsteps. He found her in the small sitting room at the back of the house. The same room from which Poirot had looked out at the garden that morning, at the frost and the stain and the opened question of the window. She was seated at the writing desk near the wall, not writing, her hands flat on the surface in front of her, looking out at the garden, at the stain in the snow, which was still visible, darker now as the afternoon light thickened, a spreading shadow on all that white. "You are thinking about the window," Poirot said, coming to stand beside her. "I am thinking about a great many things," Sylvia said, but she did not look away from the garden. Poirot pulled a chair to the desk and sat. He said quietly, "The footsteps you heard. After Gerald Fenwick returned to his room, you said they were lighter than his." "Yes, a woman's footsteps, perhaps." A pause. "Perhaps, Mademoiselle Crail." Poirot's voice was gentle but entirely without give. "I think you know more about what happened last night than you told me this morning. I think you heard something, possibly saw something that you have decided, for reasons of your own, to withhold. I am not accusing you of the act itself, but I am telling you, plainly, that withholding what you know makes your position considerably more difficult and makes mine considerably more complicated." Sylvia turned from the window and looked at him. For a long moment she said nothing, and Poirot had the impression of a person conducting a rapid and entirely internal negotiation. weighing something, measuring it, deciding. "I got up," she said finally. "At approximately 12:30, I could not sleep. I went to the kitchen to find something to drink, warm milk, if Mrs. Beach had left any. I came back through the main corridor." She stopped, and Agnes Hartwell was coming down the corridor from the direction of the east wing. She was wearing her dressing gown. She had— Sylvia paused, something in her hand. I could not see clearly. The corridor was dark, only the nightlight at the far end. Something small and dark. She did not see me. I stepped back into the kitchen doorway and she passed. Did she go to her own room? She went to the drawing room. I heard the door. Sylvia's voice was very controlled. I did not follow her. I went back to my room. I told myself there was a perfectly ordinary explanation. But you did not believe it. A long pause. "No," she said quietly. "I did not believe it." Poirot sat for a long time in Hartwell's study after speaking with Sylvia. He sat with his eyes closed and his fingertips pressed together in the manner that those who knew him recognized as the outward signal of a process that was, internally, proceeding at considerable speed. The little gray cells, as he called them, with an affection that was not entirely ironic, were working. He could feel it, the particular quality of thought that came when the pieces were close enough to their final arrangement that the mind could begin to see the shape of what was coming. Agnes Hartwell, in the corridor, after midnight, coming from the east wing, carrying something small and dark, a woman who had lived in this house for 52 years. Who knew every room, every corridor, every creak of every floorboard, who had said, that morning in the drawing room, "Oh, Edmund, I was afraid of this," and then corrected herself too quickly into something more general, who had told Poirot she had heard nothing and seen nothing, who was, by every visible measure, the gentlest person in the house. Poirot opened his eyes. He thought about the window again. The frosted glass, the smeared pane, the blood in the snow 8 feet below, with no footprints, no disturbance, only the stain. He had been turning this over since morning and he was close now, very close to understanding it. There was a mechanism here, simple probably, as the best ones always were, that explained both the blood below and the undisturbed snow beneath it. He almost had it. He rose, crossed to the window of the study, and looked out at the front drive, the snow, the stone lions, the frozen gravel. He thought about the rear garden, about the layout of the first floor, about the distance between room 4 and the drawing room, about something small and dark carried in a hand in a dark corridor. And then, quietly, like a key finding its lock, it came to him. He stood very still for a moment. Then he turned from the window, straightened his jacket with both hands, a habit so ingrained it was nearly ceremonial, and walked to the door of the study. It was time, he thought, to look at the drawing-room fireplace, the stain that frost cannot hide. The drawing-room fireplace was a large one. It was the kind of fireplace that old English country houses built in an era when heating a room was considered less important than making a statement about one's willingness to burn things. Wide-mouthed, deep-throated, faced in dark marble that had absorbed 40 years of smoke and heat into a permanent gray-black patina. The fire had been burning in it since early morning. By mid-afternoon, when Poirot crouched before it with a fire iron in his hand and began, carefully to move the ash at its base. It had been burning for the better part of 8 hours. There was not much left, but there was something. He found it near the back left corner of the grate. A small rectangle of heavier paper that had not burned completely, its edges consumed, its center blackened and fragile, but still, just barely, holding its shape. He lifted it with the fire iron, transferred it to the hearthstone, and crouched over it in the gray afternoon light. It was, or had been, a document. The paper was of a quality that did not burn easily, thick, cream-colored, the kind used for formal correspondence or legal papers. The text was gone, but along one surviving edge, in a typeface that had been pressed deep enough into the paper to leave a ghost, even after the ink had burned away, Poirot could make out 3 letters and a partial fourth, H-A-R-T. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he stood, replaced the fire iron, and rang the bell for Mrs. Beach. He asked her one question. She answered it with the blunt economy of a woman who considered elaboration a form of self-indulgence. "Miss Agnes," Mrs. Beach said. "She came down at about 1 in the morning. Said she couldn't sleep. Asked me. I'd just come down myself for a glass of water. Asked me if the drawing-room fire was still going. I said it was banked, but not out. She said, 'Thank you,' and that was all." "You did not think it unusual?" "Miss Agnes has lived in this house longer than I have," Mrs. Beach said, with the implication that Miss Agnes was entitled to do as she pleased in it at any hour she pleased. "I went back to bed." Poirot thanked her. She received his thanks with the equanimity of a woman who considered gratitude, like elaboration, largely unnecessary. He found Agnes Hartwell in the garden. This surprised him. The cold was considerable, and the snow still lay thick on every surface. But there she was, standing on the rear terrace in her coat and gloves, looking out over the white expanse of the garden. Looking, Poirot realized as he came to stand beside her at the stain beneath the first-floor window, which was still there, which the cold had preserved with perfect fidelity. She heard him on the terrace steps and turned. She looked at his face, and whatever she saw there caused her own to go very still, not with fear, exactly, with the particular stillness of a person who has been waiting, with great patience, for something to arrive, and who has now watched it come through the gate. "You found the fireplace," she said. "I found what remained of it, yes." Poirot came to stand beside her. He did not look at her immediately. He looked, as she had been looking, at the stain in the snow. "The documents are burned. Most of them, certainly. Enough to make them useless as instruments of pressure. That was what you went to his room for, not to kill him, to take them." Agnes said nothing. "He was alive when you entered," Poirot continued quietly. "Gerald had already been and gone. Wraith was at the window. Gerald told me this, though he did not understand the significance of it at the time. He was at the window, looking out at the snow. You came in. You asked him for the documents. Or perhaps you simply told him you had come for them. There was an argument. He had the briefcase, or the documents were somewhere accessible. He had been careless, perhaps, believing himself safe among people he had already reduced to compliance. You took them." He paused. "And then," he said, very gently, "something happened that you had not planned." Agnes looked down at her gloved hands. "He had a knife," she said. Her voice was entirely steady. the steadiness of a person recounting something they have already lived through completely, in the hours since it happened, and have nothing left to feel about it except the plain fact of it. A small one, a letter knife, I thought at first. He kept it on the writing table. But when I took the briefcase, he picked it up, and he was not a young man, and I think he was not accustomed to being refused. I think he had spent so many years with people giving him what he wanted that the experience of someone simply taking it was intolerable to him. "He came at you," Poirot said. "He came at me." A pause. "I am 52 years old, Monsieur Poirot, and I have lived alone in this house for most of my adult life, and I am not a fragile woman, whatever I may appear. I had the briefcase in my hand. I did not think. I simply acted." Her voice, for the first time, altered very slightly. The letter knife was in his hand. We struggled. I do not know, even now, precisely how it happened. Only that afterward he was on the floor and the knife was not in his hand any longer. Poirot was quiet for a moment. "The window," he said. "The blood in the snow, you opened the window." "I panicked," Agnes said simply. "I know that is not a defense. But I panicked, and I thought, if I could put the knife out the window, into the snow, away from the room, I thought it would be less clear what had happened. I thought." She stopped. I was not thinking clearly. I opened the window and I dropped the knife into the snow below. The sash was cold and the frost. I must have smeared the frost with my hands. She looked at the window above them. Room 4, its glass still carrying the marks she had left on it the previous night. I did not think about the blood, that the blade would still have blood on it, that it would fall as it fell. "The knife is still there," Poirot said. It was not a question. Yes, under the snow, somewhere below that window. I could not retrieve it. The garden door was frozen, and I could not go back. She turned to look at him directly. "I burned the documents. I went back to my room, and I have been waiting since this morning for you to come to me." They stood together on the terrace for a moment in silence. The Belgian detective and the English spinster, looking out at the white garden and the dark stain and the frosted window above. "You understand," Poirot said at last, "that I cannot pretend this conversation did not occur." "I know," Agnes said. "I have never asked you to." A pause. "I want to ask you one thing, however. Ask it." "Edmund." Her voice was quiet. "The documents are gone. Wraith is gone. Edmund is free of it now. Whatever happens to me, I want to know that it is finished for him." Poirot looked at her. In 40 years of his work, in all the drawing rooms and studies and cold gardens where he had stood with people at the moment of their unmasking, he had encountered many things. Guilt that dressed itself as innocence. Innocence that had the face of guilt. Calculation wearing the mask of grief. Grief wearing no mask at all. What he saw in Agnes Hartwell's face was none of those things. It was something simpler and considerably harder to look at directly. It was love. The plain, unadorned, entirely unglamorous love of a person for someone they have spent their life protecting, and who has never quite known the extent of it. "Yes," Poirot said. "It is finished for him." She nodded once. Then she looked back at the garden. "There is something I have been wondering," she said, with a quietness that might, in other circumstances, have been almost conversational. "How did you know to look at the fireplace? You could not have known from what I told you this morning. I told you nothing. No, Poirot agreed. But Sylvia Crail told me she had seen you in the corridor. And Gerald Fenwick told me, without realizing he was telling me, that he had known which side the wound was on before I had correctly stated it, which suggested to me that he had seen the body, or had been in the room when the wound was made. But Gerald had not killed Wraith. His shock this morning was genuine, which meant he had returned to the room sometime after leaving it the first time, and found what had occurred. He came back, Agnes said softly. About 20 minutes after I had left. I heard him in the corridor from my room, his footsteps, going toward room 4, and then, very quickly, coming away again. He saw Wraith, he saw what had happened, and he made a decision to say nothing, to protect someone, though he did not yet know who. Poirot paused. A family, Mademoiselle Agnes, has its own kind of closed circle, its own logic, its own silences. He looked at her. He will have known by morning that it was you. Agnes closed her eyes briefly. Yes, she said. I think he will have known. He said nothing to protect you. We have always, she stopped. Gerald is a good deal more perceptive than he allows people to see. He has learned that from his mother. Poirot nodded slowly. He looked once more at the stain in the snow, that dark, patient mark that the frost had failed to hide, that the cold had preserved, that the white perfection of the garden had been unable to absorb or disguise or render innocent. He thought about what he had said to Edmund Hartwell the previous evening at the drawing-room window. We shall see what the morning brings. The morning had brought this, as mornings in his experience generally did. Not the thing you feared exactly, but the thing that had been true all along, waiting beneath the surface of things, patient as blood beneath frost. He offered Agnes Hartwell his arm. "Come inside," he said quietly. "It is very cold." She looked at him, at the offered arm, at his face, and something in her expression shifted. Not relief, not gratitude, something older and quieter than either. She took his arm. They walked back across the terrace together, through the garden door, and into the warmth of Coldmarsh Hall, leaving behind them the white garden, and the frosted window above it, and the dark stain in the snow that the frost had blurred, but had never, not for a single moment, managed to hide.